Good evening, everybody. My name is Dave Moxham. I'm Deputy General Secretary at the STUC, and I'll be chairing today's event. Sorry if people were slightly confused there. We had a couple of questions in the Q&A box thinking that we'd started. That was just a holding slide, but I'm sure that we'll receive messages, many messages, if you can't hear us now. So as I say, welcome this evening to this event, which is the first in a series of 5 webinars that we will be running at the STUC, Rebuilding Our Economy. Just a very brief introduction to the STUC. I'm sure many people know our role. We represent 40 trade unions and 20 trade union councils across Scotland. We're a democratic organisation. We draw our policy from the affiliated organisations, but we also seek to influence policy, and we have open minds about being influenced by the views of others. In this series, in the context of the global pandemic that we're facing, is a recognition that we need new thinking for the economy. I'll go on later on today to talk about some of those other issues that we'll be dealing with in our webinar series, but today the subject of our discussion is a just green recovery. As many people who saw Boris Johnson speak yesterday know, there's many people talking about a recovery. There's people talking about a new deal, but new deals and recoveries can be slippery in the wrong hands. Boris Johnson described himself yesterday as having to reject the notion that he was a communist for bringing forward a new deal, which was barely 0.2% of GDP compared to in Germany 4%, and of course Franklin D. Roosevelt, who he compared himself with, who invested 40% of US GDP as part of his New Deal program. So we're here today to talk about what a real green recovery looks like. Just a couple of notes about this event before we go on. This is a webinar, so if people want to post questions, if they want to post points, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and deal with as many of those as we can. We expect our 3 speakers to present for around 10 minutes, which hopefully will allow us some time at the end for the Q&A session. So the real question that we're looking at today is, what does a real Green New Deal look like? The trade union movement has many views on that, a variety of opinions and a variety of enthusiasm and in some cases concerns about what a Green New Deal is. And the 3 speakers that we've got today are Miriam Brett. We have Miriam is the Director of Research and Advocacy at Commonwealth. I'll say a little bit more about her when I introduce her to speak. We then have our own Francis Stuart from the STUC, our policy officer. And then we have Anna Markova, who along with Mika Minio-Paluello is from Just Transition Economics. And what we're going to try and do today is ask Miriam to lay out a little bit about what she means, what Commonwealth means by the political economy of a Green New Deal. To ask Francis to have a look at us for some of the failures and difficulties in the past that workers in key industries have faced as we've looked to try and transition into a more renewable future. And then ask Anna to talk a little bit about what some of the real policies are, what are the real policy alternatives, the investment alternatives that could be brought forward now with the political will if we're really to make the type of change that we need to do. So without further ado, and hoping that the technology is right here, I'm going to pass over to Miriam. Welcome, Miriam. As I've said, you're the Director of Research and Advocacy at Commonwealth. We've done some work before with the STUC, and hopefully we'll be doing more work together in the future. Commonwealth is a UK think tank, and it considers how democratic ownership can transform our economy how it operates, and probably most importantly, for whom it operates. So over to you, Miriam.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so it's brilliant to be here, and thanks so much to STUC for putting this together. I'll be doing a little bit of introduction into the webinar, so really asking the questions of what is the Green New Deal and why do we need it now, before we move on to the other panellists. So the question of what is the Green New Deal? Well, I think the Green New Deal has become a bit of a buzzword, and in that sense, it has a variety of different iterations, and it's evolved to mean slightly different things in different contexts and different countries. But at its core, it envisages a future of economic and climate justice that transforms our economy with a programme of policies, with a series of investments, with different regulatory frameworks, in a way that recognises that the causes of climate and inequality crisis are one and the same. And I think if this agenda is to be genuinely transformative, it needs to begin with an understanding that our economy and our ecosystem are inherently interwoven, and recognise that concrete efforts to safeguard against climate breakdown necessitate a reimagining of the financial rules. And I think this requires some challenging around some misguided assumptions underpinning much of our mainstream economics. So without, for example, understanding that the extractive financial networks undercut revenue needed for a Green New Deal, without understanding that decades of hacking away at regulation has fueled the dilapidation of our ecosystem, without understanding that the default response to crisis management, that is austerity, has undermined the capacity for state-led just transition, iterations of the Green New Deal will fall short of being genuinely transformative. So why do we need it now? Well, I think it's important to look at what the current state is. Just now, we're off track to meet the well below 2 degrees target set at the Paris Agreement. And I think it's important to recognise here that the agreement itself was actually branded a death sentence by many states from countries particularly vulnerable to climate disaster. On Saturday, the Arctic Circle reached 38 degrees. And I think in our current context, in the kind of pandemic landscape that we're living in just now, in the UK, emissions are set to fall by 7.5% this year. But that only takes us to 2006 levels, so that misses the reduction needed for the 1.5 target. So taking the scale of this into account, small adjustments at the margins of an economic model driving collapse won't secure a livable planet or a future fit for us all. And the twin goals of the Green New Deal, that is climate justice and economic justice, necessitate questioning not only how our economy is run, but whose interests is it run in. So we're going to look a little bit about who's driving climate breakdown, and there's a lot of kind of misguided and misguided assumptions like overpopulation that are really actually kind of racist and completely misjudged. I think what we need to get to the heart of this is that 100 companies have been the source of more than 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. And the richest 10% of people produce half of the world's global emissions. And we see this inequality replicated in UK consumption patterns as well. Lower income and other disadvantaged groups contribute the least to climate change, but are most likely to be affected by it. So where do we go from here? Well, as it stands, companies, corporate lobbyists, institutions, and legal structures use power and wealth to influence political decision-making processes and capture that democratic process. And some argue that the economy is broken, and it is broken in many regards, in so much as the devastating effects that it has on our communities, on our environments, on inequality. But on the other hand, it isn't really broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. But I think what's really important here is that none of it is set in stone. And twice before in living memory, we in the UK have radically transformed ownership of our economy, first in the aftermath of World War II, with the creation of the welfare state, and again in the Thatcher years with the devastating rollout of privatisation and deregulation. There's nothing natural about our economic structure, and we do have the power to change it. It'll just take breaking with business as usual to do that, away from an extractive model that's driving climate breakdown and concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a few, and towards a new ecosystem of democratic ownership, governance and control to reshape how we create and redistribute wealth in a post-carbon economy. And what's it mean in the Scottish context? Well, for me, people always speak about, when they speak about the creation of the Scottish Parliament and they speak about the achievements of the Scottish Parliament, they so often speak about measures that were taken to reject a lot of Thatcherism and that rollout of deregulation or privatisation, like the abolition of right to buy council homes, for example, or free tuition. More recently, looking at the development of a state-owned energy company, the Scottish National Investment Bank, or a wellbeing economy. I think what we need to do now is harness those values and channel them into a planned economy, emphasis on planned, fit for the future. And I think every state has two options just now. We either wait until it's too late and we're forced to witness deindustrialisation on an unprecedented level, or we invest and reorientate our economy away from short-term growth for some and towards a planned economic transition to ensure that any winding down of fossil fuel production is accompanied with the creation of high-paid, high-skilled jobs in green industries. And it extends far beyond traditional green industries. The just transition needs to be about everything. It's about insulation in our homes. It's about the details of trade agreements. It's about tax structures, asset management, collective bargaining, business regulations. It should really encompass every aspect of our economy. And at a time of climate breakdown, for me, a Green New Deal is just common sense. Dave touched upon it a moment ago, but probably goes without saying that yesterday's announcement from Boris Johnson was not that. It is a modest reprofiling of capital expenditure that's only £1 billion more than the refurbishment costs of the Palace of Westminster. I don't know what the creators of the actual New Deal would have made of yesterday's speech, but needless to say, it's very insufficient and falls so profoundly short of the type of transformation that we need to see. So I suppose that in place of economics of enclosure, of extraction, of concentration of ownership and economic power, we need to look towards new models of public ownership and reimagined household economy that challenges the social and economic inequalities of a fossil fuel age. I think I'll stop there to give way to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Miriam. That was a really excellent, more than an introduction, a really strong scene setter for us there. And there's certainly one question that's come in which you can have a read of and come back at the end, just to make it clear to folk. We're going to take the 3 presentations and then questions at the end. And I'm not sure, I just received a message from someone, I'm not sure if it's because I should declare an interest or not, but they told me I forgot to say that I'm a member of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission. That's not the hat that I'm wearing today, but I meant to say that in my introduction. So if there's anything, I suppose, particularly directed at the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission, then please feel free to chuck that in too. But I am now going to turn to my second speaker, who is also my colleague, Francis Stuart, who's Policy Officer at the STUC. Amongst many other things, Francis is the author of 2 recent reports, or 1 report and an update on it, which really deals with employment, historic employment in the renewables sector. And we're hoping that he can cast some light on what the current situation is, which may then shed some light on what we need to do to improve that. So over to you, Francis, welcome.
Thank you, Dave. I do have a presentation which I'm just going to try and share here for people to see. Can everyone see that now? Dave, maybe you can let me know if that's all visible.
Yes, it's visible, Francis.
Great, brilliant, thank you. So yeah, as Dave mentioned, I'm going to mainly talk about some work that the STUC have done around jobs in the low carbon and renewable energy economy. I think that's important in order to, I guess, have a baseline of where we are now, in order to think about how we address that going forward. And I think one of the questions that came in around sort of corporate ownership of the renewable sector, hopefully this presentation will address some of that. I guess the first thing just to say is, I don't think the idea of a green recovery is necessarily new. So this quote is from the former First Minister Alex Salmond back in 2010. So it's sort of post-financial crisis, and very much framing the idea of Scotland's renewables as a response to coming out of that recession. Alex Salmond also spoke about Scotland being the Saudi Arabia of renewables. He spoke about reindustrialisation of Scotland's sort of post-industrial communities. And he also spoke about a large number of jobs in renewables. So the 2010 low carbon strategy spoke about 130,000 jobs in renewable energy in the low carbon sector by 2020. And in some ways, I guess the story of Scotland's renewable sector has been of massive success. It's certainly been of massive expansion. So this graph shows the growth of installed capacity in renewables from 2009 to 2019. So as we can see, it trebled during that period. A large part of that is onshore wind. And currently, renewables in Scotland make up 90% of Scotland's electricity consumption. But during the same period, we haven't seen the jobs growth which was predicted. So this data comes from ONS stats, which were published earlier this year. That's a survey of 25,000 businesses about jobs in the low carbon sector. It started in 2014 and the data only goes up to 2018. So that's the period for which we have data, but it shows that jobs in that period hovered between 22,000 and 24,000. If we look a bit more specifically just at jobs in renewable electricity, which is sort of the fair comparison to this graph, we can see a slight increase from 4,700 to 5,700, but nowhere near the level as to what was predicted or what you'd expect from the increase in capacity. And I guess to sort of give a short answer as to why that is the case, we import a large amount of the content and the goods and services that make up our low carbon and renewable energy economy. So this graph shows Scotland's exports minus its imports, so effectively its trade deficit. And we can see that increased from minus 78 million in 2014 to minus 189 million in 2018. I just wanted to dig in a little bit more about why that is the case. And I think that the place to start is around ownership. And this specifically looks at offshore wind as a sort of, I guess, a case study of the issues in the low carbon and renewable energy economy more widely. As you can see from this graph, 45% of Scotland's offshore wind is owned by overseas multinational companies, 29% by overseas governments. So the Chinese government, the Danish government are big players in the offshore wind sector. They own a large part of Scotland's offshore wind. 25% is UK multinational companies. So you're talking about the SSE, Scottish and Southern Energy there. We do have just under 1%, which is owned by the UK public sector. That's one wind turbine off the coast of Leven, which is a demonstration turbine. It's only offshore when the tide is in, so it sort of doesn't really count. And I should say, actually, this data is from Transition Economics, so it's thanks to Anna for this. And I guess the issues with that ownership structure is that those companies have existing global supply chains that they tend to use. So this map shows the sort of next three big offshore wind projects in Scotland. So we have Niart-na-Goy, or NNG for short, sort of 50 miles off the coast of Fife, Inch Cape, and Seagreen. Niart-na-Goy is owned by EDF, the French government-owned company, 54 turbines worth £2 billion. Inch Cape is owned by Red Rock, Chinese government company, again, £2 billion project. Seagreen is owned by Scottish and Southern Energy, who I think have just sold half of it to Total, the oil and gas company. 114 turbines, £5.7 billion project. So they're clearly massive projects, and you might think that if you look further along the coast there, you see the Bifab yards in Methil. So Bifab's a company that used to produce the rigs for oil and gas rigs. It moved into producing what we call the jackets for offshore wind. So that's the sort of foundations which the towers and the turbines sit on. So they could be producing or manufacturing and constructing the jackets for these projects. Instead, they're being effectively offshored. So Niat Nagoi are planning to import the jackets from Indonesia. That's 7,000 miles away. Each jacket, they're shipped across 2 at a time, accounts for about 4,500 tonnes of CO2. We calculate, if you're counting 54 jackets, that's the equivalent of 53 million cars on the road for a day. Sea Green as well is looking to import jackets from, we think, United Arab Emirates. So there's clearly issues around offshoring jobs. There has, however, been some jobs created, but when some of these jobs are created, there's issues around the quality of those jobs. So some of the jobs that are being created is around survey work. So seafarers basically going out and doing survey work on the sea. And this table basically shows examples of where those seafarers have been paid less than the UK minimum wage. And you can see if you look down the table there, if you look to Horizon Geosciences and Fugro, that's survey work relating to 2 of those offshore wind projects. It's Inchcape and Sea Green. So there's clearly big issues around the quality of work and exploitation within that work. We also know that in terms of offshore wind compared to oil and gas, the accident rate is twice as much in offshore wind as it is in oil and gas. That all might sound very sort of pessimistic or depressing. I just wanted to, I guess, highlight that there has been quite a strong campaign from workers at Bifab, supported by their trade unions and by the local community, to fight back against that. So back in 2017, there was 1,400 workers at Bifab. Unfortunately, now there's none. They're effectively mothballed. I think there's maybe 6 staff keeping the company going. But back in 2017, they marched on Parliament to basically save the company, and they were successful in doing that. Unfortunately, it hasn't had any work since then, but they are still around and fighting to campaign for work to go into those yards. We've had sort of packed out town hall meetings with over 100 people in them. We've taken the campaign to EDF's headquarters in Edinburgh. We've got the support from across all political parties in Scotland, and even the likes of Jeremy Corbyn coming to Kirkcaldy town hall meetings. But I guess that those people and those workers and those communities need the support of politicians, but they need the support of politicians not just to say your campaign's great, but actually to do some things and to act. So in terms of things that we think they should be doing, these, I guess, if you think about, particularly around offshore wind, the steps that you need to go through to construct an offshore wind farm, it needs planning and leasing for that area. So in Scotland, the Crown Estate Scotland is a company owned by the Scottish Government that leases the seabed to developers. And they could be putting stipulations on that work to make sure that when a company gets the lease, that it must invest in local work and local communities. Currently, they don't do that. There's issues around investment, and we really need to sort of challenge and address that issue of concentrated private ownership and overseas ownership. And we think the government could be looking at a publicly owned energy company, the Scottish Government that is, that invests in generation. So they have said that they are interested in setting up a retail company, which would basically buy off the market and sell to consumers. There's a whole host of problems with that, not least that there's no profits to be made in it, and this sector is in crisis. But if it looked a bit more upstream at generation, then there's things that they could be doing there. There's also issues around sort of intervening in the supply chain and in low carbon infrastructure. So we think a national infrastructure company should be explored. That could be looking at things like offshore wind, but it could also be looking, and I think Anna might talk a bit more about this, but things like energy efficiency in people's homes. That's a sector which is probably much less likely to be able to be sort of offshored. So there's things they could do there. And then at a UK level, there's issues around the subsidy scheme. So the contract for difference programme is how all these projects are subsidised, so as well as, so all these companies are making big subsidies without having to have any regard to local jobs. So we think that should be reformed. I guess just to conclude, there's a link to the report there. I guess similar to what Miriam was saying, I think there really is sort of two futures to look at here. One is the current system where we continue to throw money at the market, very much a rigged market. If we follow that route, then we'll fail to build an industrial base. We'll have continued flatlining unemployment. We'll have increased carbon emissions from the transportation of content from halfway around the world. We'll have increased economic inequality with the value and wealth being captured by overseas governments and companies. And we'll really have, I guess, workers in Scotland losing any faith in the concept of a just transition. And the alternative to that is one where we recognise that our renewable resources are, well, our renewable resources, and we should be thinking about holding them in common through public ownership and other forms of collective ownership, and really have some mechanisms for worker and community control over those projects. I'll stop there, thanks.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Francis, and both for a really concise presentation there, and to both of our speakers for keeping to time so far. So I'm going to move swiftly on. I mentioned earlier that Anna Markova is one half of transition economics. Transition economics are currently undertaking research for the STUC, and Anna will correct me if I'm wrong, for the TUC too. We released a few weeks ago some of the initial findings from that research, and I think the TUC also did that last week too. So this is really live work that Anna and Mika are undertaking, and we hope that it will inform some of the concrete policy proposals that we can bring forward in the future period as we attempt both to address the climate crisis, but also to address the COVID crisis. So it's over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Dave, and thanks for having me here. Sorry that it's just me. It was supposed to be the both of us, but Mika had to do some childcare. I'm just going to try and get my screen share going. Hopefully, there we go. I think that worked. Okay, so my brief today is to talk about the potential for an infrastructure-based stimulus package in Scotland. Now, the research that we've been doing on behalf of the STUC as consultants has been initially defined as kind of broadly what's the job creation potential as Scotland goes through the climate transition and decarbonises different sectors. However, in the context of the pandemic crisis, we decided to kind of draw the lessons from that into a shorter research piece that goes, okay, what can we do right now? And specifically, what investments in infrastructure can be helpful to a healthy economic recovery in Scotland and have the sorts of benefits that we want them to have. So, if I can, yeah, there we go. So firstly, I'll just talk briefly about what makes a good economic stimulus in the context of a big crisis. And it's important to note that we didn't start from the point of view of, okay, what does a green stimulus look like? We wanted to think about all forms of infrastructure investments that a government could make right now and think about the benefits that those bring. Those include climate benefits, but climate benefits right now are not the main thing. So the main thing that we need to see from a stimulus is creating jobs quickly. That slightly unreadable small graph that you can see on the right-hand side is the number of advertised vacancies across the UK. And you can see the really sharp, steep drop at the very end of the graph, that's how the number of advertised vacancies in the UK has nearly halved just this spring because of the pandemic. That's the scale of economic challenge that we're dealing with. And there is also data to suggest that Scotland in particular, and particularly young people in Scotland, are some of the hardest hit by the crisis, by the unemployment. So we need to create jobs really quick. And some of the lessons from the stimulus programs that other countries implemented after the 2008 economic crisis have said that investing in projects that are ready to go really, really quickly and ready to create jobs quickly is absolutely essential to leveling out the economy, not just unemployment, but also things like public revenue and sort of circulation. Countries like the US to some extent and South Korea did much better at getting out of the crisis in 2008, 2009 through these kinds of quick infrastructure investments. But quick job creation is not the only thing. And this is a list of criteria that we've kind of summarized from a World Bank paper that's aimed at government decision makers, where the World Bank says, okay, these are the criteria that you might use to judge how well an investment is providing economic benefit and social benefit. So aside from short-term job creation, which is the thing I just said, there's also the question of, do these jobs in the short term lead to longer term job creation, or are you just building something that is not going to provide any jobs in the future? There's the question of whether a project targets or is able to at least include regions that have been historically held back economically. There's a question of whether it builds domestic manufacturing and in particular low carbon technology. Does the project support the decarbonization of industries that otherwise would find it really difficult? So for example, heavy industry, industry that might find it difficult in the future to adapt to stronger climate regulations. Does it support the transition in those industries? Does the project improve productivity, develop skills bases? Can it survive a reinstated lock-in? Does it support health, public services, social fabric, and does it improve the resilience of the land to climate change or other challenges? So these are the full list of the economic and social criteria that we used. And we looked at, I think, around about 25 proposed projects specifically in infrastructure that different people have suggested as possible things that government might invest into at the moment. So I will share briefly with you some of the results of that research. So what projects were found to be the best value for money for creating new jobs quickly? So in terms of the jobs multiplier, i.e. How many jobs are created by a £1 million investment over the course of a year, the projects that came out top in our assessment were all energy efficiency projects, so retrofitting social housing and public buildings and evaluating the energy performance of buildings. Closely followed by building cycle lanes and pedestrianisation schemes and building social housing. In terms of the kind of absolute numbers of job creation, the biggest absolute number on job creation, or the biggest number of jobs that can be created by any one of these projects that we assessed is retrofitting social housing. So that can provide 34,000 jobs over the course of a 2-year stimulus. I should mention that these are all projects that we're assuming run roughly over the next 2 years, because that's the sort of time frame that we need from an economic stimulus. So social housing retrofits are followed again by cycle lanes and pedestrianisation, reforestation schemes, rail network upgrades, and finally, research and development for decarbonising heavy industry. So things like developing demonstration hydrogen or industrial carbon capture and storage projects. Now, the scores that you see on this page are just scores out of 20 based on the criteria that I mentioned before. So the projects that scored the best for other forms of social and economic benefit, aside from quick job creation, are again retrofit projects, energy efficiency retrofit projects, constructing a factory for electric vehicle batteries, again R&D for heavy industry, and then commissioning new electric buses and ferries for Scotland's public transport networks. So that was just a really quick kind of whistle-stop tour of what scored how well, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of kind of how do these projects fit together as a vision for what they can do for the economy, and I think some of them could be really quite transformative. So in transport, these projects, our suggested projects, can provide a really big step towards fully electrifying Scotland's transport network, as well as supporting the existing public transport networks and expanding them. So as I've mentioned, the projects include building a battery factory to support electric vehicle manufacturing, which is something that the car industry is going to need in the future if Scotland's going to continue making electric vehicles, renewing the bus and ferry fleets. Buses in particular, there's a manufacturer called Alexander Dennis that already, based in Falkirk, that already makes electric buses for different cities in different countries. Supporting industries like that, supporting manufacturers like that should be a crucial part of a stimulus. And then our project also includes expanding electric vehicle charging networks in rural areas, which is something that that's kind of struggling at the moment. In cities, electric vehicle charging is already expanding, but rural areas are kind of lagging behind. Nobody really wants to invest in it, so this is a great opportunity. And finally, expanding the rail network and providing some needed upgrades. So in housing, what our assessment suggests is building enough social homes per year to meet the demands that that Shelter have assessed, which comes down to 2,000 extra social homes per year in Scotland. Developing, and this is an opportunity to develop technology for offsite manufacturing and the timber industry in Scotland, and that's really crucial for kind of developing the construction technologies for the future, and also making sure that there are more safe and stable manufacturing jobs in the construction industry in Scotland. Our assessment also includes retrofitting all social housing, or rather making sure that all social housing in Scotland is retrofitted to at least grade C in terms of energy efficiency, and then delivering an assessment of energy performance for every home in Scotland, whether social home or rented or owner occupied. And finally, expanding the existing plans for district heating schemes. And the last example I'll just mention is the energy sector. So as Francis has already said in his presentation, the supply chain in Scotland for the energy, for the renewable energy sector has really been starved of contracts, of investment, and the deployment of offshore wind in Scotland hasn't really led to the sorts of job numbers that have been promised before. So in our assessment, an infrastructural stimulus can be part of fixing that problem by upgrading ports, shipyards, fabrication yards like BIFAB, and other manufacturing facilities in Scotland, in order that they can compete for and receive contracts for the larger offshore wind farms that they at the moment aren't able to build. And this may, and I think we can also get onto this in the discussion, this will also kind of shore up the role of the state and the public sector in the renewable energy sector, which is also something that Francis has mentioned as needed to fix the problems there. So one lesson to highlight out of all of this is that even though we didn't start with only green projects, so-called green projects, for example, our assessment included things like building roads. The projects that come out top in terms of how many jobs they create, even discounting other sorts of benefits, are also green projects. So things like energy efficiency retrofits, for example, come out top in that assessment, and that's discounting any other benefit. However, if you take the question kind of the other way around, it doesn't follow that every possible green investment is also a great investment in terms of job creation. So for example, we assessed in our assessment on the World Bank criteria, a project that involved putting up lots of solar panels on commercial and school roofs across Scotland didn't do very well because that project wouldn't create an opportunity for developing a Scottish supply chain, for developing jobs, skills, productivity. We just don't see that as a kind of realistic outcome from that, and therefore that project doesn't really fit. It also wouldn't create enough jobs directly or in the supply chain. So this is just kind of for a review. I'm very happy to share the presentation with anyone who wants to, and also our kind of preliminary report is up on the STUC website that lists all of this, but this is kind of the overview list of projects that we've recommended, and the last three at the end with the kind of stop emoji are the ones that we assessed but realized as a result of our assessment weren't really worth supporting. The projects add up to an investment of £12.6 billion over the next 2 years, and they have the potential to create around about 130,000 jobs in Scotland over those for the duration of those 2 years. So thank you very much for having me, and yeah, looking forward to discussing this with you.
Anna, could you take your presentation off, please?
Of course, sorry about that.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna, for that. We've got questions coming in thick and fast. I think what's going to happen now is that our panelists are going to join us. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to throw, I'm assuming that Anna's still with us, I'm going to throw a couple of specific questions back to Anna because they are quite specific to the report that she gave. I'm then going to do the same to Francis, so I'm almost going in reverse order here. And I'm then going to go back to Miriam just for some first responses. Anna, just to check that you're with us.
Yeah, I'm still here.
That's great, fine. Anna, I don't know if you've seen the questions, but there's one which is very specific. Now, I have to say this comes from my friend and comrade Richard Hardy, who's also on the Just Transition Commission with me, and we don't necessarily see eye to eye on issues relating to cycling. So Richard, thanks very much indeed. Richard's asking you where the figures for cycle lane building jobs come from.
Sure, yeah, I'm very happy to provide more detail, but as a kind of brief response, the way we derive the figures is we looked at what an investment, what scale of investment is necessary and ambitious but just about realistic for the next couple of years, and in this case I believe this was based on providing 50% of towns, urban areas with a pedestrianisation and cycling kind of scheme, assessing the streets, providing a temporary set of cycle lanes, and then making some of them permanent as it becomes clear which ones are actually used, and which ones work best. So providing 50% of towns with that form of a scheme, and then the job numbers are derived using multipliers that we source from a variety of sources, mostly government sources. I'm very happy to find out for you exactly which multipliers were used for that if you're interested.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. And the other question, although I'm going to slightly, I'm going to go halfway to trying to answer it myself, but it's in relation to foods essentially. That's me just trying to find the exact word. The role, obviously, I think we're all aware of the role of meat and dairy in emissions production. And the question is, what about investment in sustainable food? Now, I'm going to kind of guess that as a model to invest in, there may be some issues in terms of meeting both of the criteria that we're talking about today, which is emission reduction, but also job creation. But I thought I'd just kind of throw that over to you because it was a specific question about. Let me put it this way: why didn't you come up with a plan for investing in diversifying meat and food production?
So our assessment actually includes a scheme for helping farmers switch to organic farming. That was the one project that's food related on there that you can see. The reason that a kind of redesign of the food system wasn't included is because we're looking at infrastructure investments that you can make and that are really quickly ready to go in the next 2 years. So I totally agree with you that meat consumption in general has to scale down, and the food system has to be overhauled in all sorts of ways. But what we're looking at here is just investments that are being proposed by different people, such as, for example, the National Infrastructure Commission, and that can start very quickly and go for the next couple of years. So it's just a question of research brief, really.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Francis, turning to you. Miriam, I think we had you switched off for an extended period there, but welcome back. You probably heard that I'm gonna come to you after I come to Francis. Francis, you and I may try this together. There's a question there about the contracts for difference that you mentioned. So just to recap Francis's point, contracts for difference are the regime by which the UK government offers subsidy for wind farm construction by a guaranteed price for electricity, unit price for electricity into the future. And there was a question there, I wasn't quite sure where the figure came from, Francis, of 6 to 7% of local content being already defined within that. As you know, there's more to that to be said, and I just wondered if you had a bit of clarification on what the contracts for difference currently say and what our critique of them might be.
So this is, I'm not an expert in this area at all, but my understanding is that there isn't any requirement within the contract for difference for there to be local content. There is targets by the UK government to try and increase local content, and I think they're up at maybe 40, 50 or 60% of
it's actually 60%, yeah. Yeah,
I thought it was 60%, but that's over the lifetime of the project. So that a lot of that is about operational content, and actually where the value and where the jobs are created is in the capital content at the beginning, and that tends to be the lowest. So that's usually much further down. So I guess what we'd want would be capital content at 60% or higher to be part of the contract for difference project, and at the moment it's not.
Yeah, so I mean, Francis has essentially hit the nail on the head there. There's extreme difficulties in monitoring to start with the content of a project over the length of the period, and frankly, it's unclear, given that from inception to the end of the price subsidy, we could be talking 15 years. It's really unclear as we reach the end of that period how enforceable or what could be done. So our position is very clear that there needs to be much clearer, not just targets, but requirements, and that should be all through all phases of the project, but the construction phase in particular. I'm gonna shift across to, I suppose, a slightly more general question, and everyone's welcome to come in on this, but I'm gonna kind of start with you on this, Miriam. There was a kind of pretty depressed kind of initial question, which you may have spotted, which is, I suppose, a little bit about, has the horse just bolted, at least when it comes to renewables? And I'm going to build on that a little bit. I suppose certainly when the latest incarnation of the US Green New Deal, conceived by people like Ocasio-Cortez and those around her, popularized by Bernie Sanders, there was certainly a degree of opposition amongst trade unions in the USA to that. It certainly wasn't met with with open arms. And I guess the political concern is that we get to a certain stage with popularizing the New Deal or some of the investment elements of the New Deal, but then it's then imprinted on and fails at the last hurdle, if you like. It's imprinted on current forms of ownership and delivery, and that you get halfway there, but the bit that actually delivers the value for people and for communities doesn't make it past the finishing post. So I was wondering if you've got any reflections of that, and of course, if you have, a perfect political answer to how we deal with that difficulty.
Well, I've never had a perfect answer, no. But I think it's about trying to conceptualize the Green New Deal as something much bigger than traditional green jobs, right? Because if it's about ownership and it's about transitioning away from an extractive economy that is concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a few, and recognizing that that same economy is the one that's driving and fueling climate breakdown. So it's looking at a transition away from that economy to one that is rooted in democratic control, that's rooted in sustainability, that's rooted in justice and equity. That should never fail to deliver for communities. That should be rooted in the needs of communities, because it should be about high-paid, decent jobs. It should be about skills transitions. It should be about a planned transition. So it's not looking at a rapid deindustrialization with nothing else there. It's looking at a rapid deindustrialization to the scale and pace that we need in a very short time frame that we have to address the climate crisis, but that's met with investment, that's met with regulation, that's met with rising standards of collective bargaining, it's met with high-paid, high-skilled jobs, it's met with adequate skills transitions. So I think part of it's about planning and kind of seeing the climate crisis and the economic crisis as interwoven and driven by the same factors, and recognising that as a kind of foundation for how you start to build a new economy. So I suppose there's that, and I think kind of some of the worries and the concerns around a transition, particularly in the renewable sector, and I saw there was a question there about the kind of corporate ownership of renewables, and I think that's a really good point to raise. And I think it's important to point out that the public actually support public ownership of energy. 52% of the public support public ownership of energy. I think only 20% don't. So it's overwhelmingly popular. And I think there are really good examples that we can look to of alternative models of ownership for energy. We could look to Munich, that developed an energy supply chain that is 100% municipal and 100% renewable energy, that was done by demand of kind of recognising the failure of the current models. Norway, quite a famous example, created Statoil, the state-owned energy company, created a sovereign wealth fund that's used to top up benefits for enjoyed by the whole of society. We need to transition away from that, but lessons can be learned as to how you kind of secure the benefits of a fossil fuel industry for the good of society. And I think kind of moving beyond sovereign wealth funds, we could look at the creation of a social wealth fund. Just now, borrowing costs are very low. And looking at kind of how we could leverage a social wealth fund to help to help finance the just transition. And I think we could look at decentralized models of ownership as well. We could kind of acknowledge that private energy monopolies can sometimes be a barrier to the likes of community development, of community-owned energy projects, particularly in rural cases in Scotland. I know that's been the case in a lot of our island communities. And I think we could look to local infrastructures as well. How does cooperatives, how do community interest companies get a stake and say in how energy is owned and distributed? So looking at community wealth building as a strategy for energy ownership at a local level as well.
Thanks very much indeed. Right, I'm going to kind of like throw in three questions. Oh, excuse me. I'm going to throw in three questions now. I'm going to throw in three questions now, which are kind of related, and it may be your chance, three panelists, to kind of pick what you want to say, and by then we may well be moving towards the end. And I suppose they're all quite big questions. Richard Hardy, who's on again, asking me to make it clear that he's not anti-cycling, and if I was going to interpret his position for him, it would more be a little bit about the concern that for instance, city-based cycle routes are all very well, but if you haven't got a transport infrastructure that allows people to actually access them, then whilst, if you like, the job making might work, the access and the kind of the other part of the justice, which is the justice to the potential consumer of these things, isn't in place. That wasn't really the question that you put that I wanted to drill down into. It was a little bit about job quality. So Anna, the question there, I suppose, was job quality over job quantum when we're looking at these schemes. There's also a question in there about finance. So, I mean, the precise question is, wouldn't the Scottish Government need more borrowing powers? But I don't know if anyone on the panel can give some idea of the kind of quantum that we're looking at here and how that compares to other stimuluses. If not, I may have a go of that. And the third one, maybe a bit for you, Francis, to pick up on, is there was a question there really about is our supply chain failure, or the failures of our supply chain, purely down to cost, or is it down to capacity and investment too? So there's an awful lot there, but I thought I'd let the three of you kind of pick and choose. And probably, given that it's 7, use it to give us any further gems or final comments that that you want to make. And I shall start with, if you don't mind, Anna, can I start with you and see if you can pick some of that?
Sure. Yeah, I think I absolutely agree on job quality, and I think with any of these schemes, it has to be a requirement. It has to be a requirement for funding that, for example, effective voice and union recognition has to be part of the whoever's carrying out the project, whether it's in the public or private sector, and ideally in the public sector. On cycle schemes, absolutely agree. I think it has to be a package of expanding rail, expanding bus networks together with cycling infrastructure. Otherwise, it doesn't benefit enough people. And on finance, I think other people might be able to answer this better than me, but my understanding is for some of these things, yes, the borrowing limits put on the Scottish Government are restrictive. However, some things can actually be achieved by local authorities rather than and funded by local authorities rather than central Scottish Government, and some things are actually outside of the limits on the Scottish Government's borrowing power. So, for example, rail upgrades don't fall under the same limit. It's funded separately through Network Rail. I just wanted to actually highlight one question that was asked that Dave hasn't lifted out yet out of the questions, which is the one about care work. I just wanted to say that while what I've presented focuses quite heavily on construction and manufacturing really, and it does that because these are some of the worst impacted sectors, and because infrastructure is one of the ways that you come out, bring an economy out of a crisis, I think investment in care work and investment in the health sector is absolutely really important, and it has to be, you have to take what I've just presented as just one part of a stimulus that also looks at social services, care work and health.
Thank you. And Francis, I think.
Okay, so yeah, just on the price question. So my understanding is it is a bit of both. So the issue with offshoring to Indonesia is that it's very obviously low cost labour. It's also a tax avoidance zone. So yeah, it's mainly about offshoring at the lowest cost. But there are some issues with, for example, the bifab yards and infrastructure in Scotland, which my understanding is they're very muddy fields, for example, which causes things like after painting, if you get mud on the paint, you then have to repaint things. So there does need to be investment there to improve things. I just wanted to, I guess, touch on a couple of other questions which Dave also didn't.
Thanks, Francis.
But it was around, I guess, how to have a positive response. And I guess two things. One, the stuff that Miriam was talking around community wealth building. I think there is something we can do at a local level to try and influence local authorities, and you might have more power through your trade union movement and through local campaigns at that level. And actually next week's webinar is on community wealth building, so come back and join that. But also I guess around, so the climate change talks have obviously been postponed this year, but they will be in Glasgow next year. And I think there is an opportunity to think about how we don't just mobilise around that, but actually the COVID crisis is also having an obvious impact in the North Sea. So you're looking at potential 30,000 jobs lost there. And I think there is an opportunity to try and bring those energy workers together who previously might have been seen as competing against each other, to think, okay, we're all a bit screwed now and the current system is screwing us all. So how do we actually have a collective response to that?
Thanks very much indeed, Francis. I think the message from the previous two panelists is answer whatever you like.
And just cheekily flag, as I'm on their expert panel, that if anybody wants to look into community wealth building examples in Scotland, they've got an amazing project in North Ayrshire just now. But yeah, you'll hear more about that in the next webinar. Yeah, so I suppose just to touch upon the kind of job quality element. I think it's a really good point, and I think it's sometimes missed out of the discussion because you're looking at kind of the numbers of people that can be employed as part of a transition as opposed to what type of employment they have, and I think that falls into the category of asking kind of whose interest is the economy run and operated in. And I think we need to kind of be mindful, specifically looking at the fossil fuel sector and the pay disparity and the insecurity in many of the contracts that we see just now, that actually the wealth, the immense wealth that is created off the back of a lot of our energy sector is wealth that we create in common. And I think that needs to be at the absolute heart of, recognised at the heart of a just transition, that everybody involved in the creation of that wealth should share the benefit of it. And in that sense, looking at decent pay equity, looking at reduction in shareholder compensation, looking at the likes of the creation of inclusive ownership funds, for example, secure employment, enhanced collective bargaining, decent pay, decent employment rights, needs to be at the heart of any kind of just transition. And I think also just where the just transition should sit as well, kind of at the absolute heart of a worker-led industrial strategy. I think if we don't recognise that, we'll fail to recognise the kind of level of shift of ownership over our economy that we need. Thanks
very much indeed. You know how Prilly's an old trade unionist by ending up with a worker-led industrial strategy as your final comment there. Listen, folks, I am going to draw this to a close just with a couple more comments. We're still kind of experimenting about optimum length of these sort of events, and I kind of feel like on this one I could have gone on for another 20 minutes, but I think we're all we're all still finding our feet in terms of attention spans and the many webinars that are on just now. But I found that incredibly useful and interesting. And I do want to thank all three of our speakers, as well as the 25 odd people who threw in questions, and the 100 or so people who are on this call. As Francis has said, or I've said, and Francis has underlined, this is part of a series of webinars. We're starting with 5. We may well come back to this subject. It's not exactly going to go away, but we're starting with 5. If people can still see Francis, he raised his eyebrows, so that's because he's got to organise them. And the next one, as Francis has said, is on community wealth building. And one of the speakers, we're still finalising our lineup, is Councillor Jo Cullen from North Ayrshire. So Miriam certainly got her reference correct there too. In terms of this webinar, we have recorded it, so we'll be able to share it. We will be sending links to everybody who registered for this event, links to future events, but also links or actual presentations that you've seen today. We're also open for suggestions by email of other topics that we should cover. But I do just want to end, because it's nearly 7:10 now, by thanking everybody for participating. I hope you found this useful. We have all of the reports will be available to you, and I'm sure this is a discussion that we'll return to, and hopefully with some of the speakers and some of the attendees that we've had today. So thanks very much to everybody, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.